Welcome, Pavel Kořínek, researcher at the Institute of Czech Literature of Czech Academy of Sciences and scholar of Czech comics. Welcome, Pavel.
Thank you for having me. Nice to see you.
So one of the big questions is, how did you get into comic studies?
I did get to comic studies, as I think a lot of people who do comic studies nowadays did. I loved comics when I was a kid. I loved reading comics when being 5-10 years of age, and then I slowly grew out of them, or that's what I thought. I started studying Czech language and literature, which is a literary history master degree or master program at the university. And after several years, I was thinking about what should be my master thesis. I was thinking about what should I focus on in my research. And somehow comics came back to my mind. At the time, the first new wave comics were starting to be published in Czech Republic. David B's Epileptic was published at the time. Spiegelman's Mouse was published at the time. So I took another look at comics and I saw, wait a minute, there's a whole new field for me, field that's what I thought not described enough, not analyzed enough. We didn't have any history of Czechoslovak comics at the time. We knew just a few chapters, just a few somehow accidental parts of its history, but we didn't have any concise idea about how the history of Czech and Czechoslovak comics looked like. So I thought, okay, that's a nice thing to look at. I always loved comics. It will be nice to take a look at it in more thorough detail. So I decided to write my master thesis on the narratology of comics, narrative of comics. It was in 2003, 2004. And I did, and it somehow stayed with me. I was working more and more on researching Czech comics and thinking about how the narration in comics works, how these like omnipresent ideas of narratology, like focalization, like narrator, like all these things work in comics. And what I was learning learning for myself was that they work differently and they are really interesting to look at, and they can tell us a lot about how these things for the theory of narration or theory of narrative work in general in different media, not just in literature. And from that, I was slowly becoming more and more involved with comic studies. Together with a few colleagues of mine, we asked for a state-funded grant project in 2009 called Comics History and Theory. And we managed to get the funding. We managed to get quite substantial grant program, which allowed us to work on the history of Czechoslovak comics and the introductory volume to theory of comics. Yeah, and since then, that's my main field of expertise.
Yeah, and of course, there's even within the institute that you're affiliated, that you work for, the Czech Academy of Comics, which is quite remarkable. Tell me, so let's go, take us a little bit on this journey of Czech comics. My feeling is that this is very, well, as you say here, signals from the unknown. For many outside of Czechoslovakia, this is an unknown. Can you, take us a little bit on your journey?
Yeah, the history of Czechoslovak comics started somehow similar as did the history of other European comic scenes. In the second half of the 19th century, in the humor magazines, in the newspapers, in the culture magazines, there started to be published these proto-comics, some sequential narration done by images. But at the time, there were nearly no speech balloons, there were nearly no panels, like panel borders, and there were nearly no seriality. At the beginning of the 20th century, this somehow changed. When we are trying to locate the first proper comics. Obviously, it's always hard to define when did the comic started in Czechoslovakia. It's hard to, I mean, pinpoint the exact date, obviously. But when we are trying to do that, journalists oftentimes ask you, when was the Czech comics born? So you have to come out with some answer if you don't, even if you don't want to. So it was after the beginning of Czechoslovakia as a sovereign state. Czechoslovakia was established following the end of the First World War in 1918, and the establishment of the Free Czechoslovakia meant a boom of a newspaper printing, of the new magazines, of the new journal, some revival of culture, obviously. And with that, a lot of new magazines started, and in these magazines, they were trying to work out new formats, new types of content that would fit in to these magazines. And that's when the comics, or some works that we would today call comics, started to be published in these magazines. If we can take a look on a few pictures, that's what we're seeing now. That's the original proto-comics of the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. These type of works where you have no speech balloons, you have sometimes captions in verse, like we see on the left, and then it slowly changed towards more modern, if you want to use that term. Here we see the first proper comic series, or the comic series that's considered as a breaking point of the development of Czech comics. This is a pranks of Ferdík Vovísek and Bobeš the Goat, which was the series done by Josef Lada, who was a really famous cartoonist and illustrator at the time. He's also the author or the artist behind the illustrations for the Hašek, Good Soldier Švejk, which is it's quite famous for them. And this was basically stories of this rascal called Ferdík and his anthropomorphized friend Goat Bobeš. And in this series, we first saw speech balloons in Czech comics. We first saw seriality. These episodes were published weekly in the newspaper. There were some spin-offs, and this was also the first series that was collected into its own publication. It was collected in 1923 to a book format. So we are now at the beginning of the 1920s, and the Czech comics is, in a way, somehow similar to what's happening in Germany, what's happening in France, what's happening in all these other European countries. When we take a look at the other examples, this is late 20s, beginning of the 30s. You see classical, this is somehow classical comic strip of the time. You see use of the speech balloons. There's some cartooning done in the panels. You see that the drawing style is somehow influenced by the contemporary comic strips from abroad. So at the time, Czech comics was really on the similar level as comics in different countries. In 30s, as we will see, there were these really popular series that became really popular at the time, and they were basically aimed at kids. Czech comics of the 1920s and 1930s was predominantly a kids genre. We didn't have that much comics aimed at adult readers. We didn't have comics in newspaper like in American Sunday newspaper supplements. These comics were predominantly printed in the children supplements or the children pages of the magazines or the newspaper. First really successful magazines came slightly later. These are some more strips from the 1930s. As you can see, at the time, the more common type was this caption series, like these comics that don't use speech balloons, but use captions underneath, or in the case of the strip on the right, above the panels. These two former types were somehow fighting in Czech context, and the variant with speech balloons was perceived as somehow vulgar by Czech critics or the Czech didactic authorities. In a way, this type of formal presentation with the caption underneath was perceived as more literary because it was usually done in verse, and it was perceived as something more appropriate for the children readers, while speech balloons were perceived as something vulgar and something foreign. This caption series had its connections to local Czech way of telling stories, while speech balloon was always perceived as something foreign. These are some examples of the first Czech comic magazines, first dedicated magazines aiming mainly on comics. On the left, we have Koule, which is the translation sphere, and next to it Kocour, the cat, which was this attempt to build a comics magazine around Felix the cat. It was in 1927. As you can see, you have Felix the cat by Pat Sullivan and Otto Messmer in the cover image. But these magazines were not really successful. They were quite expensive at the time, and both these magazines ended after few numbers. Koule managed to finish its first year and was ended in its second year. Kocour ended after 5 issues. On the right, we have the first really successful comic magazine called Punta, which started in 1935, and it was really its first really successful comic magazine aimed at at small children. We'll talk about Punta a little bit more. So that was a first really successful magazine. These 5 boys are probably the best known Czech comic heroes of all times. They're called Fast Arrows, and they're a club of 5 boys aged from 15, the leader in yellow, till and 11, the one on the left in the red shirt. These stories of Fast Arrows were enormously popular. It was the first really like overaching success of the Czech comics. This comic started its publication in 1938, and after a few months, it became a huge hit. For the magazine, it managed to multiply its print run. It started on 50,000 copies, and within a few months, it went to 220,000. That was how popular the series was. When we take a look at the pages from this comics, I think we can see why it was. When you compare these pages, these episodes from the Fast Arrows series with the stories I showed earlier, we've seen earlier, I think that you can see that this is more dynamic comics. This is definitely more modern way of drawing it. On the left, you see these physical humor. You see that it's colorful. It's really something that catches the eye, while the older series managed to be slightly tamed for the taste of the audience at the time. This series really changed the image of comics in Czech society, but it started at the wrong or at the sad point of the history. It started in December 1938, so obviously after 3 months Czechoslovakia was occupied by Nazi Germany, and several months after that, Second World War started. So this comics was at risk of being banned nearly immediately. When you take a look at this series, it somehow works as the litmus test of Czech comics. Whenever Fast Arrows were published, Czech comics was having its better times. Fast Arrows managed to be banned 3 times over the span of next 30 years. In 1942, Fast Arrows were banned, Punta was banned, and basically all Czech comics ceased existence following the successful assassination of Reinhard Heydrich and the tightening of the protectorate regime. When the Second World War ended, Czechoslovak society was slowly returning to normal, and with that renovation and new life started some of the new comic series as well. Comics returned to newspaper, comics returned to magazines. Also, Fast Arrows returned with new episodes. But once again, after just 3 years, another disaster came. In 1948, as I'm sure you well know, there was the communist coup in Czechoslovakia in 1948, and for the next few years, comics was really out of Czech media. All comics were banned. Comics was perceived as something imperialistic, something foreign, something that doesn't have its space in the new media of the communist Czechoslovakia, and really everything ended. At the beginning of the 50s, there were nearly no comics in Czech magazines. Fortunately, it slowly became eroded a little bit after in the second half of the 50s, after the breaking of the Stalinist cult and stuff like that. Comics slowly started returning to Czech media, to Czech print media. But when you take a look at this comic page from the beginning of the 60s, you see that it was once again formally tamed. There were no speech balloons. They managed to use more like these caption series or the illustrated series because they were afraid that it would be something once again difficult or even dangerous for magazines to print. That was in the 50s and the 60s when Fast Arrows were banned, and they were banned, as I said, 3 times. For the first time during the Nazi protectorate regime, for a second time after the 1948, and for the third time after the Soviet invasion in 1968. Whenever these comics were banned, they were these like supplements or these comics that somehow played a similar role, but using more ideologically conformist view of the stories. For that reason, we have this somehow special genre of Czech comics. We have this genre of club comics. These groups of boys, usually boys, girls are not that much present in Czech comics of the 20th century, but these stories of boys living their lives in cities and having their adventures on streets and in landscape on weekends became this really prominent genre of Czech comics in the following decades. As I said, in 1968, there was another catastrophe for Czech comics and for Czech society, and it was the Russian invasion that somehow crashed the Prague Spring movement. Nevertheless, at the same time, there were several attempts to revive comics or to bring comics more to its readers. While in 50s, comics were altogether banned, after 1968, they were not that much banned as they were regulated and tamed. There were no more any comics for adult readers. Adult readers were not supposed to read comics, but comics for children were somehow able to continue or even start new projects if they were when they were conformist with the ideological ways of Czech communist regime. This is the longest running Czech magazine, comic magazine called Čtyřlístek, 4-leaf clover. This magazine started in 1969 as this funny animal comics for small children, and it's still being published to this date. They celebrated the half-century anniversary last year, and what is, I think, astonishing is that this series is still drawn by the same artist, Jaroslav Němeček. He started drawing it when he was 22 in 1969, and he's still drawing it today. I just received the latest issue today by post. And that's basically your common funny animal stories as you know the genre. You have four friends, cat, dog, rabbit, and piglet, and they live together and enjoy similar stories that has something similar with, for example, Disney comics, or with all these funnies as known from Dell Comics and all these type of publishers and magazines. That's the probably another legend of Czech comics, together with Fast Arrows. That's what Czech people think when you ask them what is comics. They will tell you that's Spider-Man for some reason, but leave that to the side. But also Čtyřlistek and Fast Arrows. In another 20 years, new Czech comics started following the Velvet Revolution in 1989. That's when the current revival of Czech comics started. That's when we returned to free publishing. That's when we returned to free society, and when new comics started to be published. While in communist times, comics was limited to just several genres, like we only had comics for children, usually just humor, or funny stories, not that much adventure comics, and definitely no comics for adults. After 1989, comic genre landscape widened and opened, and Czech comics started to grow and evolve much more quickly, and to size that it never had before. And that's basically the situation we are at now. Since year 2000, we see this really strong wave of revival of Czech comics. We have new artists, we have new genres, we have new magazines, new books. Czech comics is right now at its golden age. Every year we have more comic publications being published than the year before, than the previous year. Right now, the size of a Czech comic market is quite good, and also comics is nowadays perceived as a some part of cultural landscape. Comics is not anymore just something on the corner, on the border with sketch or pulp, but comics is perceived as this cultural medium that can enrich its readers, that can bring new ideas to cultural landscape. With this, what goes is the state support of comics. It's possible to get some funding for publication of your comic book. It is possible to do state-funded comic research. It is possible to ask for some grant projects, which is, I think, fortunate for Czech comic scenes, because for a long time, Czech comic artists were used to work with no hope for any reimbursement for their work. These two images show catalogs of the exhibition called Generace, Nula, Generation Zero, where the title of the exhibition and the title of this generation somehow alludes to the fact that they started, these artists started their work around year 2000, but Zero also has no idea whether they will be paid for their work. Zero publication possibilities, no publication platforms. And for the last 20 years, this is really getting better and better. Czech comics is right now in, I think, brilliant shape, but we'll see what will happen in next decade. Yeah, these are just some example of contemporary comics. Czech comics is right now really varied in genre, varied in formats, varied in topic. We have about 500 or 600 publications every year. So yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in Czech comics nowadays.
Really exciting, really exciting. What are we seeing here, Pavel?
That's just, I think, one example that's made from Pavel Kořínk's comics big adventure of Pepík Czech, which was this important comics or graphic novel for Czech context, because that was the first comics or graphic novel that won the prestigious literary award. It won the best book for children in 2012, which was somehow important moment for development and evolution of Czech comics, because obviously comics at the time was somehow confirmed to be quality reading for children and by the external audience. Obviously, it is always difficult and it is always somehow contradictory when comics start winning these literary awards. On one hand, I don't know whether I should be happy or saying, come on, wait a minute, we should be celebrating comic for being comic, not for being literature. But obviously, when you're considering acceptance of comics by society, acceptance by the criticism by its critical audience, it is hugely important moment when comic wins prestigious award, as did Pepík Czech in 2012.
Yeah, you know, as important, say, as the Pulitzer for Spiegelman, right? So let me hear. So okay, Saudek as the king of Czech comics, as the king of the Czech, not just comics. Why? Tell us a little bit about why this is so significant in the history of Czech comics.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't have Saudek in the previous part because I knew that we are going to talk about him a little bit more. Kája Saudek was this artist who started publishing or presenting his work in the second half of the 60s. And that's when the Prague Spring movement was gaining momentum. That's when this thaw was happening. That's when it was more and more possible to publish freely. And that was also the time when Saudek came with his new ideas about comics or this popular culture, visual popular culture. When you take a look at Saudek's art, you see a totally different image than we've seen in the previous presentation. You see this brilliant craftsmanship, you see this brilliant artwork, obviously aiming at adult audience. You see this artwork that's influenced by American masters. Saudek was a huge admirer of Milton Caniff, for example, and you see this artist who is really on top of his skills, who does a brilliant art, who does this erotic art, which was something that was really unthinkable up to that point in Czech comics, who does this pin-up art, who does adventure, dynamic action comics with a little bit of teeth. And that was something that was totally new in Czech context, that was totally never before seen in Czech context. And he became really popular. Within few months, he was really sought out artist who was extremely popular. He was working with movie production. He was preparing stills for feature films. He was publishing his comics magazines. And he even started this, I think, the most ambitious project, which was unfortunately doomed by its timing. What we see now is cover of the Muriel and Angel's graphic novel, which was first graphic novel in the proposed series of 12 about this medical doctor, Muriel, and her intergalactic adventure stories with angels and evil generals and stuff like that. It was graphic novel that, if it was published at the time abroad, I think it would change the idea of what Czech comics or even comics can do. It was 150 pages long graphic novel done in this square format. It was hugely influenced by the subcultural or the contraculture movement of the late 1960s. It was beautifully drawn. It was really strong with it anti-war, anti-militaristic message. And it was really one of a kind. We never before had something like that. Unfortunately, this graphic novel was finished in 1969, 1 year after the Russian invasion, and it was impossible to publish something like this. The only thing we had was a black and white sample of it, which was published in one weekly magazine, and then it was banned, it was locked, and no one saw this beautiful graphic novel before 1990, when it was published after the Velvet Revolution. Saudek managed to finish 2 volumes of this graphic novel, Muriel and Angels, and Muriel and Orange Death, but unfortunately, that was it. Only 2 volumes of the series were finished. But still, these are, I think, probably the best drawn Czech comics of the 20th century by far. Story is somehow, when you look at the story now, you see these naive adventure comics with a lot of subcultural allusions, with some contra-cultural notions. You see some satire in it. You see some political glimpses or some hints on the contemporary political situation in Czechoslovakia. But I think that these are really Saudek's masterworks. These are the things he ever done. And these are probably the best Czech comics of the 20th century by far. And these are just some more examples. He was, I think, really one of a kind artist. When you take a look at the composition of the pages, when you look at his work with color, what he does with two-tone color, or what he does with the full page, as you can see on the right, that was a huge format. It was A3 format, which is about 40 centimeters to 30 centimeters. That was really something. Yeah.
Yeah, remarkable. What happened to Saudek before we move on?
I mean, he always wanted to do comics, but it was impossible to publish this type of comics during the normalization. So he was doing some commercial art, like he was illustrating some newspaper magazines, like articles. He was doing some work for television, and he returned to comics after the Velvet Revolution. But for him, it was too late. He was getting old at the time. He had a difficult life, so it was hard for him to return to comics. He changed his style quite a lot in 70s and in 80s. He became more and more interested in Möbius work. He started using different type of art. And unfortunately, he had an accident. He fell to coma, and he was in coma for, I think, 8 or 9 years before he died about 8 years ago.
That's hugely tragic. It's also tragic that his work didn't get the kind of planetary, distribution that it deserved, right?
Yeah, I think that if I think what should be presented to the world audience of comics from the comics of the 20th century, I think that Muriel or some Saudek comics work. In a way, it's somehow similar to these like newly found comics that are being translated to French or to English nowadays. Like you can somehow put it in, obviously it's totally different, but you can somehow see similar level of brilliance as in Eternaut, Esterheld, or as these type of works from the 60s, 70s that are slowly becoming appreciated by comic audience nowadays. So hopefully we'll see some Saudek in translation.
So why, you mentioned earlier, Pavel, the popularity of Punta, and we're back at that, but maybe you can share, I mean, you've done this masterful, beautiful volume, but why is this so, why do you think it got at the heart of Czech readers, and not only kind of using animals, but using animals in a way to maybe like Aesop, maybe have a double code?
Yeah, I mean, Punta is an interesting example. I think that I did this book together with my wife. We worked on it together, and we prepared this book on Punta. And the subtitle of the book is "Forgotten Hero of Czech Comics," because he was really popular at the time of his publishing in the 30s and the early 40s, and then he was nearly forgotten. Like while Saudek or Fast Arrows, these are still those monoliths of Czech comics. Like contemporary artists know them, somehow allude to them. Punta is nearly forgotten, but at the time of its career, it was extremely popular. It was really the most popular comic magazine of the time. I think there were several reasons for the popularity, and there were several reasons for the fact that it was forgotten quite quickly and quite thoroughly. Punta started as a translation series. That's what's, I think, first really interesting thing. Punta is obviously the Czech comic series and Czech comic magazine, but the first episodes of Punta were in fact translations, and they were translations of the, I think, similarly forgotten American comic strip called Dolly Dimples by Grace Gabby Drayton. Here we can see on the top we have the original panel spread from Dolly Dimples and Bobby Bounce by Grace Gabby Drayton, which was this comic strip that ran from, I think, 1928 till 1933 in several American newspapers. And beneath you have the Czech version, Czech translation of this strip. For some reason, one women magazine at the time started to publish these translations. We don't know how these translations came to Czech context, but we think that they came to Czechoslovakia via Germany. When we take a look at the next picture, you see some reason why we think that. Because on the left, we have this original panel by Grace Gabby Drayton. On the right, we have Czech version of that panel. And in the middle, we have a German version we managed to find in Thüringer Allgemeine Zeitung in the 1933. And when you take a look at the onomatopoeia, you see that the Czech version definitely adapted the German one. What we think is that these translations were not legally produced. We think that these were illegal reprints done by a Czech publisher, and for that reason, we think that they had access to only a limited amount of episodes. And while this series was really popular, they decided to hire a Czech artist to do some new episodes in the similar series, and that's how Punta came to being. The guy on the left is René Klapač, the artist of the series, who was really well taught and really able comic artist. He studied in France. He even published in France comic magazines at the time. He published in Benjamin Weekly, and he was asked to prepare these new episodes of Dolly Dimples. Focus of the series moved from the Dolly Dimples to her dog friend. In original series, he's called Comfy, while in Czech translation, Punta means spotty. And that's how Punta stories came to be. Under Klapač's art directorship, Punta evolved into these anthropomorphized fun animal stories with some romance attached to it. Punta marries quickly. He has children, as we've seen on the cover. And these adventures were really interesting. Yeah, here's I think, one of the most beautiful covers. This is from November 1935. And he's really, as you can see by his hat and by his bow tie, living his urban life of this high society of the First Republic Czechoslovakia of the middle 1930s. And that's I think one of the things that's really unique about Punta is that it gives you a glimpse to popular culture the image of like urban society in the interwar period in Prague or in Brno at the time. Punta was really brilliantly imagined and realized series and project, because Punta was this attempt to do comic magazine, to do this really modern comic magazine and do this really commercially successful comic magazine. You see that Punta was really attached to several merchandising attempts to produce some toys and some pins and stuff like that. There were theater plays about Punta. There were illustrated books. They were costumes. You were able to borrow a costume of Punta and use it. There was a really this huge world of Punta. What I think is also interesting and unique about Punta is that it was really strongly working with contemporary popular culture, and especially American and the Western popular culture. When you take a look at the, I think, next slide, you'll see that Punta was really on the same level as the celebrities of the time. On the left, we have Punta in this jealous scene when his wife Kiki is jealously looking how Punta is hugging Greta Garbo. And on the right, you see Punta with Laurel and Hardy as their friend and as their colleague. Punta became the official merchandise magazine of Laurel and Hardy Fun Club. And at the time, Laurel and Hardy became heroes of the Punta strip, colleagues of this dog, and together they were living various adventures in Czechoslovakia as well in United States. Punta comes to United States as a gift to Shirley Temple, and he brings Shirley Temple back to Czechoslovakia, and he shows her Prague, which is somehow funny, funny story when you consider that Shirley Temple, several decades after that, became ambassador of United States in Czechoslovakia. So Punta was the first dog who introduced your future ambassador to Czechoslovakia. You can see that from time to time they even managed to adapt the exact scenes from the Laurel and Hardy movies. This is from March of Wooden Soldiers, and basically the story or the whole narration of the film was adapted to comics in Punta. Underneath you see another cover of Laurel and Hardy Punta magazine. The other, I think, unique aspect of Punta was that, in a way, Punta was Czech version of the Disney magazine, even though Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck were never allowed to act or to be present in the magazine. At the time, in the 1930s, all around Europe, you had these Disney magazines being established. You had Topolino in Italy, you had Journal de Mickey in France, you had all these Mickey magazines in United Kingdom, you have Mikamish in Croatia. In Czechoslovakia, we had no Disney magazine. My thesis or my theory is that Punta was somehow filling the spot of the Disney magazine. Punta was working with some Disney comics, as we can see on this cover. For example, the comic strip adaptation of Snow White and Seven Dwarfs was published in Punta. This is celebratory cover introducing the first few episodes of Snow White in Punta. And Punta was somehow telling the similar stories as the Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck comics at the time. So for Czech context, Punta was our small Czech Disney. Yeah, and that's just, we were extremely lucky that we managed to find a publisher who fell in love with Punta as we did. So he allowed us to do, I think, quite lavish monograph on Punta, which consists of two books. The first one being called Stories, reprinting 200 pages of the original comics. The original comics has about 550 pages, so it's quite long. It's not collected run, unfortunately, because it would be impossible to do. But still, 200 episodes is still quite a lot. And the second volume is called Studies, which is this our attempt to do magazine-centric monograph on comics.
Yeah, absolutely beautiful, and a lot of work I know that you guys did. Yeah, we've kind of already sort of seen how adult comics were pushed kind of under and the space for children was allowed. But can you talk to us a little bit more about the censorship, and was there this kind of double coding happening that we see in other spaces where we see censorship, where like with Aesop's tales and so on?
I mean, yeah, you can definitely isolate some examples of this. Obviously, there were these like undertones or these hidden stories within stories. There were these like attempts to somehow subvert the official meaning. But what I think is really interesting for Czech comics of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s is not so much censorship as the self-censorship or some like protective self-preservation attempts to survive in the hostile environment. I think that Czech comic artists of these decades decided that when they want to do comics, they have to somehow try to offer some conciliatory entries to their work. Like they should somehow negotiate with the what's allowed and what's not. So for some reason, I think that we have different strategies of survival that can be seen in Czech comics of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. And these strategies took different forms and took various forms. Obviously, there were artists who decided that it's impossible for them to publish, and it's possible for them to do the work they want to do, and they decided they don't want to collaborate with the regime, or they don't want to have anything to do with them. Other artists and other magazines and the magazine editors decided that if they want to do some comics, they have to somehow follow the, not party line, but they should somehow try to adapt one of these strategies for survival. These strategies were really various. What we see now is one of these strategies, which was accepted or which was employed by Fast Arrow's creators in 1948. On left, you see one page from the 21st of June, and on the right, you see following episode from the 28th of June. And what you see is from week to week, the comics somehow lost its speech balloons. They decided to go for a caption series, because caption series, as we discussed before, was perceived as something higher or on the better quality level, that was perceived as something not so immediately alluding to imperialistic American, foreign, not communist. The other strategy was, for example, to mix comics with the prose segments. For magazines for kids, it was possible to present more comics when they were able to say, but we are using comics as this tool to improve ability to read. We are combining comic pages with the prose, illustrated prose pages. That was another strategy. They decided to combine it and then be able to print it. Obviously, there were some other strategies. On the left, we have this like ideological conformity. When you have a club comics, what you can do is you can take your club members and make them members of the pioneer movement, which was this state organized version of the youth clubs, and you can send them to the some event organized by the Czechoslovak Socialist Army, because obviously that's so ideologically conformist message that you can survive with comics even in this hostile area. On the right is, in my idea, a more nuanced way of negotiating with authorities, is that you were able to do a lot when you were using irony or satire. You can present even Cadillac's American gangsters, or the idea of American gangsters and American cities, as you can see in this page, when you were saying that it's a parody, it's a somehow parodical mode of presentation. Oldřich Jelínek, who was the artist of this comic strip, loved American culture, loved Western culture. For him to draw these cards, to draw these type of scenes was what he wanted to do. But for him, the only way how he was allowed to do that was when he was presenting it as parody, as irony, as something that we are looking on and saying, oh, that's it. That's not what we are having. That's not what we want. Yeah, and another, I think, quite unique aspect of Czech comics, of the normalization era, or of this era from the 1960s to 1980s, is that even the funny animal comics became more tamed and more everyday focused. Like when you take a look at Disney comics, or when you take a look at the other funny animal comics, you see these adventures. You see Donald Duck with his nephews going abroad and looking for these round eggs, or whatever Karl Barks came with. But in Czech comics, these adventures were perceived as something that doesn't fit in that well. So for some reason, Czech comics were filled with everydayness stories. You have these stories of penguins who are living their lives like we are living our small lives, going on small trips to the countryside and going to school, not having these action adventures, but really living small lives underneath the communist regime.
What do you? I know that your primary sort of focus is research, but I also know that you give lectures, you present your important historical excavations. What methods say? What is the Pavel method of kind of educating an audience?
I mean, I'm not sure whether I have method. I hope I do. I mean, I hope there is some way to for me to teach comics successfully. As you said, I'm not full-time teacher. I don't teach at the university. I'm full-time researcher. But obviously, from time to time, I do some elective courses or some lectures on comics. And what I like to do are these interpretative courses, because what is for me interesting on these comics we've seen is that even these simple stories, like Punta, like Fred at the End, like these everyday adventures of penguins, tells us a huge amount of information about society, about comics, about its artists. And when you approach it with as many methodological approaches as possible, when you combine formal analysis with some reading, with some post-structuralist reading, and even with some, for example, eco-criticism or the gender studies, you get the idea that you can take one comics and from it open the whole world of interpretations. And comics is, I think, beautiful in a way that since it's so closely connected to popular culture, since it's so closely, or at least in 20th century Czech context, comics were basically popular culture for children and youth. So that's what Czech comics was. It offers us a beautiful door into minds and mindsets of Czech kids and Czech youth and Czech comic artists of the 20th century. So what I try to do whenever I'm teaching comics is that I try to ask my students to read some comics they probably didn't read for the last 20 years. I give them 2 issues of Čtelístek, which is something that no adult read. I mean, adults read Čtelístek when they are reading it to their children, but that's not reading material for children. And I try to force this type of material to them, and for them, together we are trying to see what can be read from these materials that on the first glance look like simple, naive, but on the deeper thought offers you really a lot of thinking material. So that's basically what I tried to do. Together with colleagues, as I said, we managed to do introductory volume 2 comic studies or something like that, which was our attempt to offer a textbook of sorts. The book is called V panelech a bublinách, kapitoly z teorie komiksu, in panels and speech balloons, chapters from the theory of comics. And in this book, we decided to offer 12 chapters that are focusing on different aspects of comics. We have comics as a term, like how the term comics defines what's around it. We have comics as narrative, we have comics as a formal structure, we have a chapter dedicated to comic readers, we have chapter dedicated to aesthetics of comics, and we are trying to offer some introductory notes on how comics can be interesting through lenses of all these different disciplines and different ways of thinking about cultural texts. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to offer as wide field of possible interpretations and theoretical approaches as possible, because I think that every student and everyone who is really interested in comics can find its own way, his or her own way how to interpret comics, and that's what I like to read. I'm not that interested in really rigorously mono-methodological analysis, because quite often in these cases you get really thorough and really robust methodology, but the interpretation and analysis is somehow lacking in my opinion. When you attempt to combine several methodologies at the same time while still being correct with these methodologies, obviously you cannot mix everything with everything. But when you try to somehow combine narratological analysis with cultural studies, when you try to combine formal analysis with close reading, I think you get much more interesting results at the end. That's my opinion. I'm quite happy that, as I said, since Czech comics is having its golden age right now, we are having chances that were not possible several years ago. These are some photos from the exhibition I curated together with my colleague Tomáš Prokupek for the Yoshihiro Yonezawa Memorial Library of Manga and Subculture in Tokyo. And we managed to do a huge exhibition of Czech comics there 2 years ago. We managed to do some exhibition called 100 Years of Czech Comics for Czech Centers, which traveled all around to Europe for 2 years now. It was exhibited in, I think, more than 35 venues around 20 countries. So I'm not that much teaching on full time, but I'm trying to do this, not academic, but like some educational support for Czech comics as well.
Really important. Where is the vitality in Czech comics and comic studies? In a way, you've kind of answered that already, but maybe there's something you'd like to add.
I mean, I think that really what's happening in Czech comics right now is that since we have more and more new comics being published, we have this new artists, we have this new genres, we have this new approaches. When you take a look at contemporary Czech comics, you don't have this monolithical style. You don't have this main style level. We don't have that much mainstream style in Czech comics. You can talk about mainstream in French comics, you can talk about mainstream in American comics, you can talk about mainstream in manga, and obviously it's always simplification when you talk about mainstream style or something like that. But when you take a look at Czech comics, basically every artist is original. Like every artist is having its own approach, its own graphical style, its own way how to narrate. I think it has something to do with the fact that, as I said, these artists started doing comics with no idea about whether they will be able to earn any money for it, whether they will be able to find any publisher for it, whether they will have any audience. So when you are doing comics just for yourself, you do it how you want to do it, not how you are asked to do it or how you think that would be best to do it when you are trying to sell it. So we have really these strong artistic individualities in Czech comics right now, and I think that's what's really interesting about contemporary Czech comics. Obviously, we have some trends for several years now. There has been an abundance of historical comics, quite mediocre, in fact, but it has something to do with state support, and it has something to do with this proposed or imagined reasoning that parents are buying comics for their children, and when children are not doing that well in their history classes, we can somehow correct it with some comics about this historical era, or some king or president or whatever. But in addition to these comics, we still have these really, I think, interesting, artistically innovative graphic novels that are being published. Well, I have several examples here. When you take a look at the next few slides, I think that we'll see what I mean. Here you have on the left one of these silent comics done by Marek Rubec. On the right we have one of these historical comics, but this is one of the definitely more successful ones being done by Jaromír Švejdí, already translated to about 10 languages, and going to be published by Self-Made Hero later this year in English. Here you have examples of some comics as a tool for journalism, as comics as a tool for non-profit organizations. I think that's what's really interesting, and what's happening more and more often nowadays in Czech Republic is that these comic artists are working with some non-governmental organizations. For example, here we have examples of comics done. These are some journalistic approaches to childcare in foster homes. These are stories by the people who grew in foster care, who are narrating their stories via comic artists. It's a really interesting way how to do comics, and it's also really strong critique of this institutionalized system of as it works in Czech Republic right now. So comics is trying to do something for society. Comics is trying to persuade people to do something. Comics is bringing people to galleries. Comics is, yeah, I mean, comics is finding its power, and that's I think the best news of Czech comics nowadays.
I love it. Yeah, so much happening, arts festivals, comics expos, all of this new wonderful work. Oh my goodness. Well, yeah, Pavel, this is, what's happening in Czechoslovakia is extraordinary. I mean, I just kind of looking at some of these images of comics. Wow. Tell us about, yeah.
These are basically just images from the last 2 or 3 years. So that tells you something about like all these various forms and various approaches to comics.
Really incredible. So Pavel, from the Institute of Czech Literature, Czech Academy of Sciences, you have taken us on such an extraordinary journey through the history of Czech comics and why they matter. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, really.